In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 30, Modernism and Postmodernism in Europe and America, 1945 to 1980. In all honesty, most of this chapter is still focusing on modernism. Remember, modernism was the idea where the art world shattered, trying to respond to the rapidly changing world. The idea was to make it new. We're going to see that artists are, some completely reject the past, others still look at the past, but they try to come up with new means of ways of artistic expression. We already talked about last chapter with World War One, how after World War One we saw kind of a darkening disillusionment of the world as a whole, and we're going to see some of that continue into modernism and even into postmodernism. From 1939 to 1945, we have World War II, and with World War II, even more so than World War I, you have some horrific outcomes. We have the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945. And we saw how the world responded to the horribleness of World War I. Well, World War II was even more so, because now we see not only does the world have the power to destroy the world, but mankind can actually and did actually use it. And in fact, in World War II, we have over 35 million people who died because of the conflict. And then after World War II, we're going to see continued conflicts throughout the globe. We have the Cold War, which develops between the United States and the Soviet Union. Part of this is because of the Marshall Plan. This is where the United States, after World War II, it was their idea for their plan for assistance to help rebuild Western Europe, and they pledged over $13 billion to help rebuild Western Europe. But also part of this Marshall Plan was to prevent the spread of communism. Well, the Soviet Union, obviously a communist country, Soviet Union, communist, United States, capitalist, these two economic functions cannot work together. And so you're going to see this building conflict where the Soviet Union is trying to stop the spread of capitalism and the United States is trying to stop the spread of communism. Because of this, we have the Cold War, which develops, and this is basically an arms race where the United States and the Soviet Union start amassing weapons of mass destruction in case there ever becomes a point where there's going to be war. Also, we're going to see continued regional conflicts throughout the globe. In 1947, the British left India, and afterwards we saw the Hindu-Muslim War broke out, and this actually divided the region and created two different nations, India and Pakistan. In 1949, we had civil war in China, and after this, the communists come to power. That's how we get communist China. 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, again trying to expand communism. We're going to see the Soviets suppressed uprisings in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. We're going to see constant civil war in Africa in countries such as Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Angola, Mozambique, the Sudan, Rwanda, and the Congo. We're going to have a civil war in Indonesia that leaves over 100,000 dead. In 1962, Algeria expels France. In the 1970s, the United States suffered defeat in Vietnam. And then we're going to see in the United States continued struggles for civil rights for African Americans and women. We are going to see free speech on university campuses become an issue. And we're also going to see what develops what's known as youth culture. And youth culture, again, argued for these rights and also strongly argued for disengagement from the Vietnam War. Because of this new developing youth culture, we're going to see developments such as punk, the sexual revolution, and rock and roll. And we're going to see this youth culture actively challenging the status quo, including discriminatory policies and attitudes, and then fighting for recognition, respect, and legal protection. Now again, in post-World War II, we're going to see this very pervasive sense of despair, disillusionment, and skepticism. And after World War II, some artists tried to find redemptive value in the war, but it became almost impossible to do so. And what we're going to see develop is this idea of existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophy asserting the absurdity of human existence and the impossibility of achieving certitude. They promoted atheism and often questioned the possibility of situating God within a systematic philosophy. Many people, after the horrors of the Holocaust, questioned the existence of a God, wondering if there is a God or some higher deity, how could he, she, it allow this to have happened? Major thinkers in the existentialistic movement were Søren Kierkegaard, 1818 to 1855, and Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980. Within existentialism, we're going to see a spirit of pessimism and despair, and we're going to see this brutality and roughness that was seen in the world reflected in the artworks. And you see that in this work here. This is Alberto Giametti, 1901 to 1966. He was a Swiss artist. Interestingly enough, he never claimed he was an existentialist, but his work seemed to strongly reflect these ideas. This is Man Pointing number 5, 1947, and it's a bronze. Here, when we look at the figure is very thin, elongated, nearly featureless figure with very, very rough surfaces. And this was seen as representing the existentialist view on humanity, meaning alienated, solitary, and lost in the world's immensity. And this work gives a sense of isolation and fragility. Another existentialist work, this is Francis Bacon, 1910 to 1992, not the same as the 16th century philosopher. Here, his works were literally a reflection of the war's butchery and an indictment of humanity. What you're seeing here is Painting, 1946, and it is an oil and pastel on linen. Here, the central figure is a man with a gaping mouth and almost animal-like teeth. The red stain is on the upper lip. He's holding an umbrella, and this may be a reference to Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister during the beginning of the war, 1937 to 1940. He was often pictured with an umbrella. Now, this figure is surrounded by raw meat around him, and then a dead carcass in the background. And the work itself is an attempt to remake the violence of reality itself. All right, moving on to the next style, we have what's called abstract expressionism. Abstract expressionism is different from expressionism, but you'll see they follow some of the same ideas. This developed about 1940 to 45 to about 1960. It began in New York, and at this time, New York had become probably the main center of the art world. Now, after World War II, there was a time of increased optimism in the future, especially in the United States. We had the GIs coming home. We have different GI bills that are passed, so we have people being homeowners. This is the time of the baby boom. So the 1950s were a time of, prosperity and a little bit of hopefulness. However, by the 1960s, the arms race is in full force, and with the rise of the nuclear age, abstract expressionism eventually fades out. Now, within abstract expressionism, the art form varies from artist to artist, but there are two main characteristics that remain constant. The first is freedom from traditional use of brushwork, and the second is the exclusion of representational subject matter. The goal of the abstract expressionists was to show the expressive capacities of their own individual gestures and styles. And here you're looking at a work by probably the most well-known of the abstract expressionists, and that's Jackson Pollock, 1912 to 1956. This one is number 1, 1950, oil, enamel, and aluminum paint on canvas, 7 feet 3 inches by 9 feet 10 inches. Now, Jackson Pollock was known, his nickname became Jack the Dripper because of his style of painting, and this became known as action painting. And what it does, it draws the viewer into the action of the painting, but it also refers to the active paint handling by the artist. And you can see here, you can almost see the artist's movement within the work. And the method was spilling and dripping paint onto a large canvases that were actually placed on the floor. Pollock said he wanted the canvases on the floor so he could become a part of the painting and be unaware of what he was doing. In fact, this is a quote from him from his text, My Painting. When I am in my painting, I'm not aware of what I am doing. The painting has a life of its own. I try to let it come through. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony, an easy give and take, and the painting comes out well. And then, when asked why he liked to have the canvas on the floor, he responded, "On the floor, I am more at ease. I feel nearer, more a part of the painting, since this way I can walk around it, work from the four sides, and literally be in the painting. I prefer sticks, trowels, knives, and dripping fluid paint or heavy impasto with sand, broken glass, and other foreign matter added." And so that's what he would do. He would literally put the canvases on the floor, and you'll see him often carrying the paint can, but instead of using a brush as traditional, if he uses the brush, he takes it and flings the paint. Sometimes he would use sticks to fling the paint or drip the paint, or sometimes he would just pour the paint directly from the can. Now, there are two video clips you can see here. Again, as I said, you won't be able, if you click on the links here, they won't work, but they will work in the lecture slides that are posted under this same week. And what these are, there was a photographer named Hans Nemeth, and he created a series of photographs and two short films of Pollock working. One's in black and white, and then the other one is in color, and it's actually what he does is he places a piece of glass on the floor instead of a canvas, and he places a camera underneath it. And so you get the view of actually being able to see Pollock's creative process from the medium itself. And that's what these two clips are. The first is just a short little clip where you see Pollock's workshop, you actually hear him work, and then the second is part of the Nemeth film. Unfortunately, Pollock actually died at the young age of 44 in an alcohol-related single-car accident. Pollock was an alcoholic, and he was driving in this accident. All right, next is another artist, Lee Krasner, 1908 to 1984, and she worked with Pollock. And actually, interesting enough, she was actually better known than Pollock at the beginning of their careers, and it was because of her connections that he gained access to the art world. And Krasner and Pollock married in 1945. Her works, we still see this physical energy seen in the paintings. This is The Seasons, 1957, oil on canvas. This works, we think we can see some representations. It seems maybe there's some fruit in there, but we're not clearly sure. Some of her other works are much more abstract than Pollock's, but she does tend to show more control in her work than Pollock does, and she would often use a brush in her work. Next is William de Kooning, 1909 to 1997. He was born in Holland but immigrated to the United States in 1926. And in his works, we see these broad slashing strokes. And what he would do, he would often not be satisfied with his canvases. And so he would literally, after he'd painted, if he wasn't happy, he would scrape off the paint from the canvas. In fact, there are canvases of his that have holes in them or that he would completely destroy because he would scrape them so many times. This is Woman 1, 1950 to 52, and it's an oil on canvas. Now here you can see some identifiable items such as teeth and eyes mixed with geometric forms. But within his work, he did not consider the figures to be pictures of individual women, but mainly just images or references to maybe fertility goddesses, or even a satirical inversion of the traditional images of Venus. His goal was to have an afocal surface, meaning there's nowhere really that the eye can come to rest. He wants this to seem chaotic, with no clear focal point. He says this disorientation represents the modern condition, and he liked the instability of art. In fact, he said, "I do not think of art as a situation of comfort." Next, another female abstract expressionist. This is Joan Mitchell, 1925 to 1992. She was from Chicago. And interesting enough, abstract expressionism is often seen as a masculine form because of its violence and its energy. But you can see clearly, again, Mitchell here following these same lines. You can see this very energetic application of paint. And she excelled in action painting, which again was largely seen as a masculine art. The composition of the work is intentionally off-center, and she said, "Abstract is not a style. I simply want to make a surface work. This is just a use of space and form. It's an ambivalence of forms and space. And then the final abstract expressionist we're going to look at is Mark Rothko, 1903 to 1970, born in Russia but then moved to the United States. And he is very well known for his color fields. Now, these were very large canvases which largely focused on 1, 2, even 3 different large fields of color that seemed to just blend into one another. What we're going to see in his works are clearly the absence of any recognizable figurative subjects. He avoided references to anything specific in the physical world because it conflicted with the sublime idea of the universe, the supernatural spirit of myth, which he saw as the core of meaning in art. So he did not want anything specific in the work itself. And these works, when you see them, they seem very simple, yet there is something quite unique about standing in front of a Rothko. The works are flat, two-dimensional planes of color, and Rothko saw color as a doorway to another reality. In fact, he says the works often show his own anguish. He said, I am interested only in expressing the basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on, and the fact that lots of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I communicate with those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. And if you, as you say, removed only their color relationships, then you miss the point. And this is number 14, 1960, oil on canvas, 9 feet 6 inches by 8 feet 9 inches. All right, next, this is where I'm going to tend to disagree with your textbook. The text calls this next section post-painterly abstraction and sculpture and abstraction, I believe. This is honestly the first time I've heard this movement called of this. This movement is often referred to as minimalism. Minimalism developed in the late 1950s through the 1960s. And what the minimalists sought to do was to reduce the complexity of both design and content down as far as possible to the simplest and the fewest elements to be used. It's non-sensual, impersonal, geometric shapes and forms, and they address space and how the viewer relates to them spatially. There is no message from artist to viewer. The goal was to leave response and meaning entirely up to the viewer, and they purposely are creating works with no narrative. And you see that in the work here. This is The Bay by Helen Frankenthaler, 1963, acrylic on canvas. This is another example of color field painting, but what she would do was she would actually pour diluted paint onto a plain canvas and basically allow the pigments to soak in. She says, these are colors, and the question is what they are doing with themselves and with each other. Sentiment and nuance are being squeezed out, so if something is not altogether flatly painted, then there might be a hint of edge, chiaroscuro, shadow, and if one wants just that pure thing, these associations get in the way. So she's basically just saying, all these are these fields of color. There's no intentional shading, no intentional lines, no intentional anything. That it's just simply these color fields, and that's it. No other message, no other meaning. We see that idea carried into these works here. The one on the left is by Donald Judd, 1928 to 1994. He was a sculptor, and again, he focuses on form and shape within the works. He did not intend the works to be metaphorical or symbolic, and many of his works, such as this one, are just titled Untitled. And this is 1969, and it's made of copper. And again, it's just a focus on the geometric shapes and the use of space. No message from artists to the viewer. The work on the right is by Frank Stella. He was born in 1936. This is Empress of India, 1965, metallic powder and polymer emulsion on shaped canvas. This work is quite large. It's 6 feet 5 inches by 18 feet 8 inches. And again, your textbook kind of goes into details about all the lines and this and that. Stella was a minimalist. In fact, he said, my painting is based on the fact that only what can be seen is there. It really is an object. All I want anyone to get out of my paintings, and all I ever get out of them, is the fact that you can see the whole idea without confusion. What you see is what you get. So he's purposely, again, creating works of art that has no narrative. All right, we're going to move on. Next, this is what's called optical art or op art. This was a movement that developed in the 1960s, and what they sought to produce were optical illusions of motion and depth using only geometric forms on a two-dimensional surface. And you can see that here in the works of the British artist Bridget Riley, who was born in 1931. Here, she's considered a neo-pointillist in manner. It reflects back onto the post-impressionist artist Georges Seurat. Remember the Sunday afternoon on the island of Le Grand Château, 1884 to 1886. That large work, which was the pointillism, where everything is applied with the point of the pen. Well, this is Fission from 1963, and it's tempera on composition board. And yes, this is a painted work. And what she does is she uses black dots of varying sizes and shapes to create the illusion of a pulsating surface that caves in at the center. So we get this sense of movement and depth and dimensionality to the work that doesn't actually exist. All right, next we're going to move on to the work of Louise Nevelson, 1899 to 1988. She was born in Russia, but she moved to Maine as a child, and her works are what we call as a type of assemblage. Assemblage are where the artist finds different pieces and then they assemble into some sort of work or sculpture. Now, often in her work, she would use small wooden objects, scraps, and remnants she often found in furniture shops and factories. Now, what she would do is she would glue and nail these together in some type of wooden boxes, and then she would stack the boxes together. When she was done, she would then paint the entire work a single color to help unify it. This is Tropical Garden 2, 1957 to 59, and again, it's assemblage, it's wood painted black. Now, this collection of found objects, and literally we mean found, these are things she would just go out and find. Usually they would be looked at as scrap or as trash, but she transforms them into the artwork. It's meant to resemble a high relief altarpiece, but this unification, it makes the random pieces seem organized and coherent through the balance of the grid and the overall black coloring to unify the work. And her works are often seen as a comment on the waste and fragmentation of society. All right, next we're going to move on to a style called pop art. This developed in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the leaders were Andy Warhol, Klaus Oldenburg, and Roy Lichtenstein. Many of these images were a commentary on American consumerism, and they tried to use the communicative power of art to reach a wider audience. Pop art represented life as Americans lived it, and it often shows that American culture played a powerful role in the emotional lives of its citizens. One goal of many pop artists was to transform the everyday into the monumental, and artists often turned away from traditional painting and used more current tools where the images were made by machines. This gave many of the works a very commercialized feeling, and for that reason, most of the pop artists were shunned that their works were more lowbrow and not considered high art. We see here the work of Richard Hamilton, 1922 to 2011, and he actually studied the way that advertising shapes public attitudes. This work is a collage called Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing from 1956. And you can see here, if you take the time and study this work, he's combining high art, traditional art, and the consumer culture of the day. And so what he's doing here is he's actually showing that both popular art and fine art belong to the whole world of visual arts communication. And you clearly see in here different advertisements that are being used because he believed these advertisements had an effect on the American viewing public. Next is Jasper Johns, born in South Carolina in 1930. And what he tried to do is he sought to draw attention to common objects in the world, things that he considered seen but not looked at, meaning items that people frequently viewed but rarely scrutinized. And we see this in Three Flags, 1958, encaustic on canvas. Encaustic is actually a method of it's where you have the pigment, meaning the color, and the binder is hot wax. And so this is pretty difficult to work with, as you can imagine, because for the medium to stay fluid, the wax must remain hot. And so what this is a trio of overlapping American national banners of decreasing size. These are not flags. He painted them with the encaustic. And because of this, right, that we look at these and we see them not as flags, it actually drains the meaning from the patriotic emblem by reducing it to just a repetitive pattern. This again is a handmade painting, not a machine-made fabric. And so he takes this American flag, something that most people are very familiar with, and he recreates it in a way that is meant to encourage people to actually study and look at it. All right, next is Robert Rauschenberg, 1925 to 2008, also an American sculptor. And these works, again, are a type of assemblage, meaning it's almost a type of collage in sculpture. He would take things that would normally be discarded and he would combine them to create art. Now, this is Odalisque. This one's not in your textbook. I used a different one. This is 1955 to 1958. It's a stuffed rooster, a pillow, magazine illustrations, and paint all on wood. Now, the title refers to the Odalisque, remember the harem girls, and to an obelisk, which are the four-sided stone pillars capped by a small pyramid, often used in older art. And what he's trying to do here is he's bringing daily life to art. He says art is messy, disorganized, unpredictable, and multi-layered. The images are not mint and they are not neatly arranged, but they overlay each other. And Rauschenberg called this combined painting. And so that's what he's trying to do with this. Again, he's using the tools and the methods of the popular world and he's creating them into art forms. Next is Roy Lichtenstein, 1923 to 1997. He was born in Manhattan, and what he would do, comics were very popular during this time period. And so what he would do is he would take representations of these comic strips, both war comics and romantic comics that were popular at the time, and he would turn them into large canvas artworks. He would often print these with what's called the Ben-Day dots. This is a printing process that was invented by Benjamin Day, 1810 to 1888, and it was used in newspaper printing. And what this was, it was a way of printing comics and newspapers where you used dots of ink that weren't always connected, and this was a way of using less ink, yet the human eye still often sees the color surface as a solid. And so he would use that in the works. And because of this, since it literally was a cheaper way of printing newspapers, it would give his works, people believed, a cheaper feel to them. Lichtenstein says, pop art is the use of commercial art as a subject matter in painting. One of the things a cartoon does is express violent emotion and passion in a completely mechanized and removed style. And you see this in Hopeless, 1963, oil and synthetic polymer paint on canvas. Again, he's looking at consumer culture and using the materials of this culture to create the artworks. Probably the most well-known of the pop artists is Andy Warhol, 1928 to 1987. He first had a successful career as a commercial artist and illustrator, and he often would use objects of popular culture in his work, such as advertisement, product labels, and even celebrities. His works were a comment, again, on consumer culture. And also some of the pop artists were critiqued because this idea that artworks shouldn't be mass-produced, that they shouldn't be made quickly and cheaply. And the pop artists argued, well, why not? That's how our society is. Why can't the artworks reflect that? In fact, Andy Warhol called his studio the factory. Here the work you see is green Coca-Cola bottles in 1962, oil on canvas. It's 6 feet 10.5 inches by 4 feet 9 inches. And here again, he's showing the typical Coca-Cola bottle of the day with the Coca-Cola slogan, and he's making a comment about the culture. In fact, he said, What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coke. Liz Taylor drinks Coke. And just think, you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money you can get you a better Coke. And so he's talking about this with the consumer culture. It's available to everyone. Oftentimes, also with consumer culture, he would kind of make the comment of how consumer culture almost runs amok. And you can see that in Campbell Soup Cans, 1962. This is synthetic polymer paint on canvas. Each canvas is 20 by 16 inches, and there are 32 canvases. And why there's 32 canvases? Because these are all different soup cans from Campbell Soup. And in fact, Campbell's Soup slogan at the time was 32 varieties of soup. And what he's doing here is he's almost making a comment. No, he is making a comment about the excess of American consumer culture. Basically, here he's saying, do we really need 32 different types of soup? Interestingly enough, this is now located in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and I think it's kind of humorous. It's actually on a wall outside of the cafe there. All right, the final artist we'll look at in pop art is Klaus Oldenburg. He was born in 1929, and what he would do in a lot of his art, again, this is a different one that's in your book, but what he would do was he would take these normal everyday consumer goods and he would make them into these huge sculptures and show them in a way that they actually cannot be consumed. Oldenburg said, I try to make the art look like it's a part of the world around it. At the same time, I take great pains to show that it doesn't function as part of the world around it. And again, often he creates these massive works such as what you can see here. This is dropped cone, and this is on a building in Cologne, Germany, and it was installed in 2001. It's stainless and galvanized steel, fiber reinforced plastic, balsa wood, all painted with a polyester gel coat. It's 39 feet 10 inches in height and 19 feet in diameter. The height above the building where it's at, it's 32 feet up in the air. And so this literally, it looks like, if you just look at the object itself, it looks like a dropped ice cream cone. Yet it's being used in a way that completely changes it, right? This is, little kid's not going to be able to come and pick this up. He'll do that in other works. There's one in a sculptural garden up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he takes a trowel, a small shovel used in gardening, and he makes it into this giant, massive form, and so it becomes unusable. So again, it's these consumable goods that can no longer be consumed. All right, the next style we're going to look at is what's called superrealism. This again developed in the late 90s, in the late 1960s into the 1970s. What superrealism sought, much like the pop artists, was they sought a form of artistic communication that was more accessible to the public. Many of these artists did use photographs in their works, such as here, this is Marilyn by Audrey Flack. She was born in 1931. This was created in 1977. And this looks like a photograph, but it's not. It's an oil over acrylic on canvas, 8 feet by 8 feet. And here within this work, she studied photography, and she would often use photography as an influence in her work. In fact, she would often first project an image from a slide form onto the canvas. Most of her works are still lifes, and here you can see, unlike Andy Warhol's Marilyn, this focuses on Marilyn Monroe, unlike Warhol, where he is using Marilyn's commercial face, this is more of a still life, almost looking like the Dutch Vanitas paintings, where the still lifes are reminding us of the fleetingness of life. And in fact, there are actually multiple references to death in here. There's the fresh fruit, which will eventually die, an hourglass, which literally shows the passing of time, a burning candle that will eventually burn out, and then a watch and a calendar, all again for tracking the passing of time. All right, next we have Duane Hanson, 1925 to 1996. He was born in Minnesota, and he became well known for for perfecting a casting technique that enabled him to make these life-size figurative sculptures. What you're looking at here, I mean, obviously it's a photograph because it's on here, but these are not two real people. These are sculptures. These would be standing in a museum somewhere. And so what he would do is he would take real people and he would create plaster molds from him. Then he would fill the mold with resin. Once the resin hardens, he removes the outer mold, then cleans and paints the forms, then dresses them, adds wigs, props, and so on. And often in his works, he would depict stereotypical American behavior. This one, again, is a different one than in your textbook. I think the one in your textbook, you don't quite get the super realism in it, but this is Taurus 2, 1988. Fiberglass and mixed media with accessories. And again, these are life size. Now, these are in different museums, but they're also part of different installations. And you'll actually see people believe these are real people and go up to them and try to talk to them or interact with them, but they are these sculptures. All right. Well, then moving on, let's look at some modernist architecture. We've already talked about modern architecture a little bit. Modernist architects were very concerned with formalism, stressing simplicity. They were still intrigued by organic sculptural qualities, but again, we're going to see these very, very simply shown. Now, this is an artist we've looked at before. This is Le Corbusier. Now, this is the Notre Dame des Champs. It's a chapel in France, 1950 to 55, and it's masonry and sprayed concrete. Now, this is very different from some of his works, such as the Savoy House. Here, though, we still see this very simplistic structure. It's actually a church on a mountaintop, and it's a fusion of architecture and sculpture. The building was constructed with a steel frame and metal mesh that was sprayed with concrete. The work is asymmetrical, the windows of different sizes and shapes give it an abstract design, yet it still follows this idea of modernist architecture because unlike works such as the Art Nouveau that were organic and very ornate and decorated, here we still see very clean lines and very simple. We see this reflected also in the works of Eero Saarinen, 1910 to 1961. He was a Finnish-born architect. And here what you're looking at, this was the Trans World Airlines TWA Airlines Terminal at JFK Airport in New York. It's now known as the JetBlue Airways Terminal. But again, you see with this, it's dramatic, sweeping, curvier building made out of reinforced concrete, and it gives this theme of motion, and it suggests almost a bird and massive wings in flight. This is the same building that's in your textbook, just in your textbook the view is from above, and I'm giving you the view that you see from the street here. And so you can see it almost has this bird-like quality and shape to it, yet still simple, clean lines and design. And we see these ideas even more so in the skyscrapers that were very popular during this time period. This is Ludwig van der Rohe, 1887 to 1969. He originally taught at the Bauhaus, but then had to flee to Chicago. And within his works, this one was also created with Philip Johnson. And here we're going to see this focus on massive, sleek, geometric, rigid figures. The idea with the modern skyscraper is less is more. You're going to see this clear steel frame with glass windows and no ornamentation. And you see this very clearly in the Seagram's building, 1956 to 58, that's in Manhattan in New York. This is made of glass and bronze. It's supposed to give the idea that's sleek and powerful, but still elegant. And in fact, van der Rohe and Johnson so wanted to make sure this elegant idea was carried throughout the building, they carefully planned and detailed both the inside and the outside to create the elegant whole. All right, next, very quickly, we're going to talk about photography. Your book mentions Diane Arbus, but I want to talk a little bit more about her. She was a modernist photographer, and what we're going to see in her works, this is a self-portrait of her, is she again would often try to look at society, and she would look at parts of society that were often deemed as not beautiful or were often overlooked as somewhat other. And what she would do in her photographs is she would try to show the beauty that was in everything. Here, this is Child with Toy Hand Grenade in Central Park. It was created in New York City in 1962. And with this work, what she did is she just went to a park one day and started taking photographs of the children playing. As I said in class, don't do this. You will get arrested very quickly today. But here, this was just a little boy playing, and she kind of asked him, can I take your picture? And this is how he posed for her. He's got a toy grenade in his hand, and it's just this kind of weird snapshot of a moment. But again, you can see kind of this beauty and complexity in the work. You see this again repeated in the work here. This is Identical Twins from Rosalie, New Jersey, 1967. This is pre The Shining. And here again, it's a snapshot. It's a photo of two little girls, identical twins, who are dressed up, yet there's almost something eerie, something different about them. She would often photograph those who were considered mentally deficient or retarded. She would also want to look at people who were considered freaks of society, meaning dwarfs, or even those that were social outcasts, such as what you see here. This is a young man with curlers at home on West 20th Street. This was also taken in New York City in 1966. And at this time, this is a young man who is a cross-dresser. And this would be something that was very shunned by society. Yet again, she's showing just kind of this beautifulness within the works themselves. Arbus did not want to be known, though, however, as the photographer of the freaks that actually went against what she was trying to show. She was trying to show people were just, there was beauty in everybody. Unfortunately, though, she did kind of get that reputation. Unfortunately, she suffered from different things in her life, and she actually ended up committing suicide. All right, well, now we're going to switch to postmodernism. And so what happens with postmodernism? The main difference between postmodernism and modernism. What we saw in modernism is this, the art world shattering. And we saw all these different artistic styles that developed with artists trying to deal with this new reality. Postmodernism is still trying to do that. It's still celebrating diversity, celebrating innovation and new ideas, but what we're going to see is this questioning and rejection of what's called the grand narrative. And this grand narrative are these ideas. Think of like the futurists, right? Their idea was this is how life should be lived. Destroy the past, destroy the academy, focus on the machine. That's the future. Well, what happens in postmodernism is it says there is no one grand idea. There is no one universal truth to how humans should live. There never has been one right way, and there never is one right way. So what we're going to see now, instead of artistic styles that develop, we're actually going to see different types of art that are going to develop. And so that's why you're not going to get clear styles, but you're going to get new forms of art. Often we're going to see experimentation is still valued, and we're going to see a focus on diverse cultures, and we're going to begin to see more discrimination and looking for identity into the works themselves. So the first type of art we're going to look at is feminist art. This is from 1970s, and it came along with the second wave of feminism. First wave was early in the century when women fought for the right to vote. Now women are looking for more of equal rights in the home and in the workplace. Here we're going to begin to see that women are beginning to achieve increased recognition in the art world. And feminist art also began to be recognized in the academic world. The California Institute of Art actually developed a feminist art program in 1971. And in fact, Judy Chicago, the author of the work you see here, was the founder of this program. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at her work called The Dinner Party. The Dinner Party opened on March 14, 1979 at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The exhibition took over 5 years to create, and Chicago was assisted with over 400 individuals. Now, what happens here is that Chicago was creating a work is she was looking and she believed that women were often, their contributions were often overlooked by history. And she's saying, I'm not trying to rewrite history. Basically, I'm just trying to bring to light what these women have done, their contributions that history has overlooked. And so what she decided to do was she decided the original idea was to base it kind of on the Last Supper, and instead of having men invited, it would only be women. Well, as she kept researching what women she wanted to be in it, she wanted much more than the 13 that were in the Last Supper. So she actually decided on this equilateral triangle, means triangle of all equal sides, and there are actually 13 places on each side. So there's a total of 39 sittings. She thought it was very interesting with the number 13 is the number that represents male holiness because of the Last Supper, yet it also represents evil in women. In fact, there are 13 women in a coven. And so what happens with the dinner table itself? Again, it's an equilateral triangle. The first seat, it's the early sign of women and the goddess. And then each side of the table each side of the triangle takes up a wing. So from one, we have the beginning of time to the end of the classical period. Then we have the beginning of Christianity to the Reformation, which Chicago actually deems as the lowest point in the lives of women. And then we have from the American Revolution to the present. In fact, the last two seats are Virginia Woolf and Georgia O'Keeffe. The table itself for each woman contains a place setting. The place setting has a plate, which represents the woman, a goblet, a napkin, a fork, and a knife. And so, again, we talked about the table as 39 place settings, 13 on each side. Before you go in this, though, you walk through a hallway, and this is called the entry. And here, there were 6 banners that were created by artists on looms, and what they did is they have a poem written by Chicago on it. And the reason why she wanted this space like this is because she wanted it to clearly be a transitional space, that you were moving from the history that was known to a history that is often overlooked. Now, of the 39 place settings, each one has a dinner plate, and the plate actually represents the woman herself. Now, the 39 women that were chosen, they had to meet certain requirements, meaning that they had to, first off, the woman her contribution had to render her a representative of a particular time period. Her life needed to embody some type of significant achievement. Third, in some way, this achievement had to work for the betterment of women's conditions. And finally, they simply had to be able to find enough information about the woman. Unfortunately, there are many women that Chicago wanted to include in the work, but they just could not find enough information on them. All right, back to the plates again themselves. Again, they each represent the woman, and they represent the woman trying to rise out of the sphere that contains her. The plates are overly large. They're actually 14 inches, which is about 2 inches larger than a normal dinner plate. And Chicago said she wanted this because she wanted the viewer to know this was not any normal dinner party. The plates were actually created using a China pattern technique. This China pattern technique was traditionally handed down through women, often from mother to daughter. And she says that she used this technique not just for the aesthetic quality, but because when the women would make these plates, it was a time when the women in the culture would share their stories and their experiences. Now, the plates themselves start out very flat, as you can see in the Theodora plate on the left, and eventually they begin to rise higher and higher. And what this is that it's the women trying to rise as the status of women rise, and the women themselves rising out of their times. Now here are the 3 works. These are 3 examples. We have Theodora. Theodora is from the Byzantine Empire. In fact, she was ruled to the Emperor Justinian. Interestingly enough, though, before her marriage, she was an actress, and this was a position she was despised for by many. In fact, actresses at that time period were likened to prostitutes. After she was crowned with Justinian, though, she worked to establish many laws that improved the position of women, including initiating death penalty for rape. After Justinian died, she ruled the empire and continued to fight to improve the lives of women. And here, her plate reflects the mosaics that are in the Ravenna Cathedral she and Justinian had built. Here, interesting enough, in this plate, it took months to develop this because they wanted to get the mosaic technique looked down. Now, this is one whole plate, and what they did is they would cut into it, and then they would glaze it, and then repeatedly fire and fire it. The middle plate is Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886. She was from the United States, and what's interesting, many of us have heard of the poet Emily Dickinson, but what happens is her creativity was very at odds with the prevailing ideas of what women's supposed to be at her time. And in fact, she thought her poetry was dangerous because it was about emotions that women were supposed to repress. And in fact, she often wrote poetry that was filled with passion and rage, and she called her works a letter to the world. She wrote 1,775 poems in her life that were discovered after her death. She did not publish while she was alive because she knew her society would reject her work, so she never attempted to share them. So here the plate is made to show of the lace of the Victorian era, and it's meant to show how this lace literally imprisoned her within the time period. And then the last plate that I have here, this is Margaret Sanger's plate, and she again was an American woman, and she fought for the sexual and reproductive rights for women. She asserted that without reproductive rights over their own bodies, all other rights were meaningless. And in fact, she was the founder of the International Birth Control Congress, which was the forerunner for Planned Parenthood. The resistance that she faced is represented in the plate. You can see the bright red color of the plate is to help proclaim women's bodies of their own. In the image on the plate, unlike any of the other plates, if you look, it seems to almost be reaching around and pushing itself up off of the runner that it's on. Moving on to the runners, each plate sits on a runner or a large placemat, if you will. And what the runners represent, they actually represent the design. There's a different design for each woman, and they represent the time in the environment the woman was living in. So literally, the plates are surrounded by the environment. And Chicago intentionally wanted them to invoke in the viewer the idea of an altar cloth to give the table a type of sacramental quality. Now, each work is done in the different needlework or style and techniques that were associated with the woman's time period. And she says, my aim was to imply that history should be seen as belonging just as much to women as men. And she's trying to show this through what's been considered womanly techniques. Here, needlepoint embroidery and that has traditionally been considered the work of women. In fact, the only time historically that men have gotten involved with this is when it became very profitable. The work that you're seeing here, this is the runner of Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft was enraged by the Enlightenment ideas proclaiming the rights of men, while they intentionally denied women these same rights. In fact, in 1792, she wrote her most famous work, A Vindication of the Rights in Women. And here in that, she is arguing that if women were educated just as men, we would see they were just as smart. The embroidery work in her time is what's called stump work. Stump work is basically what you would do. There's no reference to size or portion. And stump work, you would take different scraps of fabric and you would use it to create them. Now, this runner, she said, was probably the most difficult to create, but she felt like she had to show this because what we see on the left, you can see the detail. Mary Wollstonecraft actually died because of complications of childbirth. And what Chicago wanted to show is that childbirth, it's very devastating to a woman's body. And yet often this is overlooked because historically it's been seen as women's duty to have children. And she wanted to show, this brutality on the body itself. And that's why the work, you actually see Wollstonecraft laying in the bloody bed that she'll eventually die in. Interestingly enough, the child that she was giving birth to is Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is the author of Frankenstein, or A Modern Prometheus. And then interestingly enough, Mary Shelley's name is on the heritage floor directly under her mother's place setting. So what the heritage floor is, this is the floor. Chicago decided the floor needed something, the table needed something to kind of help contain it. And she also wanted to show some of the women that were deserving of the honor, yet she could not depict with individual place seatings. So she came up with the heritage floor, which is made of 2,300 triangle tiles, and there's 999 women's names that are represented on the heritage floor. The number 999, she just thought it was a good number. Now, these names are painted in gold, and what happens is the names are connected to others they are associated with. So again, like Mary Shelley's name is directly under Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother's place setting. Interestingly enough, after its initial show, the dinner party was scheduled to be shown in 2 other museums, but they both canceled and no other offerings were forthcoming. When the show first opened, over 100,000 people came to the show. However, people, because of the public, it began to get critiqued because it was seen as a rewriting of history and a attack on men. And Chicago said that's, again, not what she was trying to do. That she's trying to show that women have always been a part of history, just their history has often been overlooked. One protesting group claimed the work was placed in storage. The work eventually had to become placed in storage, and one group who was protesting it claimed it was because the crates contained the devil and Chicago was the Antichrist. However, Chicago and her supporters would not be stopped, and despite the protests and public protests against the work, the dinner party traveled across the United States and eventually the world. Wherever it traveled, despite the protests, the work seemed to awaken people to the suppressed history of women, and often the people of the area used the funds the work generated to help further the work's cause. Now, with Chicago, she wanted to find the work permanent housing. She said because then if it didn't, it failed. And this was its most significant issue, was to help break the cycle of repetition of women's oppression. And if the work didn't find a home, she was seeing as it just being oppressed. She said the art and the history it represents would thereby be condemned to becoming mildewed, then moldy, then ultimately destroyed. Fortunately, the dinner party did find a permanent home. It is in the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art in the Brooklyn Museum. Now, this center is wholly dedicated to raise awareness of feminism's cultural contributions and to educate new generations about the meaning of feminist art, and to present feminism in an approachable and relevant way. Now, if you're interested in this work, the website, the Sackler Center website, is wonderful. It's got individual pictures of every single plate, every single runner, so you can go online and see a lot of information about this work. All right, another feminist artist at the time, this is Cindy Sherman. She was born in 1954, and what she would do in her works is she would often address how Western art presents the female beauty often for the enjoyment of the male gaze, meaning that the female form becomes an object of desire for the male gaze, and we don't see the women as subjects themselves. And so in the late 1970s, she began a series or a project called Untitled Film Stills. And here you can see a collection of 4 works from this. This collection is more than 80 black and white photographs. None are of a specific movie, but they do look very similar. Here you're going to see a variety of self-portraits in different makeup, outfits, and location. She is the image in all of these. She is the female. And the idea behind it is she is literally taking control and creating her own self that is then fictionalized, that is a fictionalized construction in every single of the works. All right, moving to postmodern architecture, what we're going to see in postmodern architecture is it is a rejection of modernism. We no longer see the simplistic, clean lines. Postmodern architecture celebrates diversity and complex styles. It claimed that the uniformity and anonymity of modernist architecture was unsuited to human social interactions. Now, within postmodern architecture, there is a great diversity in all the works, but what you're going to see a return of ornamentation, and again, you're going to see innovation being celebrated. Also, often the architects consciously selected past architectural elements or references and juxtaposed them with contemporary elements or fashion them of high-tech materials, thereby creating a dialogue between the past and the present. And you can see that in the work that your chapter opens up with. You also see this here with Michael Graves' The Portland Building from 1980. Graves was born in 1934, and here we definitely see, compared to works such as the Seagram Building, we see a lot of decoration become in this. Also, the building is square, not rectangle, and you see various decorative and structural elements. All right, the next work. This is Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano's Pompadour Center in Paris, constructed 1971 to 77. Now, what they did here is literally the building is turned inside out. So the mechanical parts, which are usually hidden inside, they're made oversized and they're put on the outside of the building, and then they're painted according to their functions in very bright colors. You see that more so in the image here. So red was vertical transportation, meaning the elevators. Green was water, yellow electricity, white ventilation, and blue air conditioning. And then you could see along the facade here, the long tube-like, these are the different escalators, usually in the center of the building. Here they're on the outside. The building itself houses the Biblioteca, the public library, which was a vast public library. It also holds the Museum of National Art, which is the largest museum for modern art in Europe, and a center for music and acoustic research. It was named after Georges Pompidou, the president of France from 1969 to 1974, who actually commissioned the building. It officially opened on January 31st, 1977. And the Centre Pompidou has had over 180 million visitors since 1977, and actually more than 209,678 visitors in 2013, including just over 3 million for the museum. And so again, here in the work, you can see it's challenging the ideas of architecture and literally turning the building inside out. All right, next we're going to look at environmental and site-specific art. Environmental works, also often known as earthworks. And here what we're going to see is an intersection of architecture and sculpture. This developed in the 1960s, and most were site-specific, meaning they were designed for the site they were at. Often these works use organic materials, and they're aimed to publicize and combat escalating pollution, depletion of natural resources, and the dangers of toxic waste. And you see that in the work here. This is Robert Smithson, 1938 to 1973. Unfortunately, he died young. I believe it was the age of 35 in a plane crash. But here you see Spiral Jetty that's located in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. This was constructed in 1969 to 1970. It's made of black rock, salt crystals, earth, and red water. It's 3 feet 6 inches by 15 feet by 1,500 feet. And literally it is it's made of the materials, and it's a large spiral that goes out into the Salt Lake. You can see here at times it's almost completely underwater. The image on the right, you can barely see it, and at times due to flooding it's completely submerged. And he knew and understood that in time this monumental earthwork would be subject to the vast changes in the water level, and it would eventually erode away. And that's part of the reasoning behind the earthworks, that they are meant to be temporary because they know over time, just like all things on earth, it will erode away. All right, next we're going to look at performance art. Performance art, what performance artists were trying to do was they were expanding the range of works that were considered art. Here we're going to look at movement, gestures, and sound performances, all performed for an audience. This developed informally in the early 1960s, and these works would often be informal and spontaneous. But by the later 1960s, due to their popularity, many museums were conditioning the works, and they would become less spontaneous. The first artist that we're going to talk about is Joseph Beuys. He's on the right, 1929 to 1986. He was a German work, and what he did is he created works that were aimed at illuminating the conditions of modern humanity. And so he had different ideas. He either called them thinking form, which is how we mold our thoughts, spoken forms, meaning how we shape our thoughts into words, and then social sculpture, meaning how we mold and shape the world in which we live. And his artworks, he wanted them to stimulate thought about life and art. And one example is the image you see here on the right. And again, I have two YouTube clips. You'll need to look at the other slides to get links to them, but you get to see some of these performance. So his work here is how to explain pictures to a dead hare. Here he appears in a room hung with his own drawings, cradling a dead hare to which he spoke softly. He coated his head with honey and covered with gold leaf, so he was representing the idea of a shaman. He believed he was acting to help revolutionize human thought so that each human being could become a truly free and creative person. But at the same time, with this idea of communicating with a dead hare, right? The dead hare is not going to understand anything. It's meant to symbolize the difficulty of achieving successful exchanges among alienated people in modern society. The other work on the left is by Jean Tinguely, 1925 to 1991. He was a Swiss artist, and what's interesting in his works is he's playing around with the idea of destruction as actually an act of creation. And so he would design works that were meant to perform, but as part of this performance, the work would literally destroy itself. And you can see that in Homage to New York, which was performed March 17th, 1960. So part of this, it was this massive sculptural, but as it performed, it then literally destroyed itself. And you can see that again in the YouTube clip provided. All right, next is conceptual art. Conceptual art develops in the mid-1960s, and the belief is that it's not the art itself, not the object, but the idea of the concept of the art that's important. And this takes some of the ideas of Dadaism, right? Remember Marcel Duchamp said it's not the object, but the artist's process. And so that's what conceptual art is playing around with. It's reconsidering the very definition of what art is. And they argue that the artfulness is actually the artist's idea. And you can see that in the work here. This is Joseph Kosuth's 1 and 3 chairs from 1965. And here he's challenging the idea of what this actual chairness is. He said of conceptual art, he said the radical shift was in changing the idea of art itself. Admit you could have an artwork, which was the idea of an artwork, and its formal components weren't important. The expression was in the idea, not the form. The forms were only a device in service of the idea. And you see that here in 3 chairs. So what he's doing, the artwork is this idea of what is a chair, what makes up chairness, if you will. And so you see in the center actually a folded chair. On the left is a photograph of the same chair. And then on the right, printed, it's the dictionary definition of chair. So you could argue that all 3 of these things you get the idea of chairness. They all help and explain to the viewer what chair is, yet they're all very different. And in fact, one is only physically a chair you could sit on. Yet the photograph and even the definition, through the concept, the human can understand the idea behind chair. All right, another conceptual artist, this is Bruce Naiman, born 1941. He's from Indiana. And what he was trying to do in his art was he was using new forms in object making, and he also wanted to take these new forms and play around with language and wordplay. So he wanted to create these works that almost seem silly, yet you tended to believe them. And you see in this work here, which says, the true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths. This is from 1967, neon with glass tubing in a suspension frame. So again, he's trying to show the artwork, not necessarily, right? You don't see an artwork, but the words themselves become the art. And so again, playing around with that concept of art. All right, next, very, very briefly, we're going to look at new media. New media is seen to develop in the 1960s and the 70s. And what new media is exactly that. It's new technologies that are being explored by artists. Some examples of this are video art. With video art, what happens is we start to have portable video recorders and then electronic devices that allow these recordings to be manipulated. Because of this, something that had originally been limited to just film becomes available to more artists. Video images combine the optical realism of photography with the sense that the subjects move in a real time and deep space within the television monitor. Eventually, we'll move on to computer graphics. This is something that we're just starting to scratch the surface of. Again, the first personal computers weren't available until 1975. Here you see a work by David M. This is called Nora, and it's from 1979. And it is a computer-generated color photograph. And so what happens within computer graphics is we see these illusionistic three-dimensional forms, and we know and we can see in today's society how easily and how well these things can be manipulated. And in fact, this new media is creating a media into a world where we don't even have tangible art, that the art itself just exists within the realm of the computer, right? It's completely virtual, meaning it's not in the real world. We can't tangibly reach out and touch this work. And so that's how postmodernism is going to end, again, with these exploring and ideas of new concepts of art.